Welcome to Akuhoai Stories. I'm Grant Walters. Your host for this fourth episode of our podcast is Gerry Kowalski, Executive Director Emeritus of University Housing at the University of Georgia. Gerry retired from the profession in 2018 after almost 12 years of service to his beloved UGA and 3 decades of dedicated work in the profession at large. Gerry has contributed in immeasurable ways to the association over the years, and he was recognized in 2020 as the recipient of Akuhoai's prestigious James C. Grimm Leadership and Service Award. Gerry's network of colleagues, friends, and mentees anticipate his frequent porch reports on social media, sharing his thoughts and observations on life from his Georgia home. While the pandemic prevented him from hosting friends in person, he reached out with an idea of gathering some of his fellow campus housing retirees for a virtual conversation to reflect on the state of the profession over the past year and a half and offer perspective based on their years of service. Joining Gerry is Joni Schmidt, Director of Residence Life, Central Michigan University, Emeritus, Vickie Hawkins, Director of University Housing, Georgia Southern University, and Senior Associate Director of University Housing, Appalachian State University, retired, Michael Schultz, Emeritus Director of University of Housing, Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville, and Chuck Rhodes, Emeritus Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs and Enrollment Management, Sonoma State University, and current doctoral student in Afrocentric Community Building and Organizing at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. The combined years of experience, friendship, mentorship, and hard work between our 5 guests in this episode are staggering, and the memories, kindnesses, and richness of their contributions are heartwarming. We're glad to give our members a seat on the porch to listen. Here are their stories.
Hello from the porch at Akuhoai. I'm here virtually with 4 outstanding and retired housing professionals. All are experienced, accomplished, and skilled. And ladies and gentlemen, even better people. Among us is represented almost 200. That's 200 years of professional experience, as well as diverse worldviews. We're going to start out with some introductions, and I will turn it over to Joni Schmidt.
Well, thank you, Gerry. I am Joni Schmidt. I am retired from Central Michigan University, where I served for 38 years. And I began my career at CMU as well. I was an RA there. And then my degree was in Parks and Recreation. And at the time, I wanted to work for a city parks department, and the budgets were really non-existent. So I looked back at my experience. And since I'd been an RA, I decided housing might be a good fit. So I spent a short time at Miami of Ohio in their grad program. And then I was an RHD at Ferris State, and then returned to CMU for 2 years, which quickly turned into 38. So as I said, I retired in the director position and received emeritus status. So loved my time at CMU and loved my my time in housing.
Delighted to have you with us, Joni.
Thank you.
Let's go to Reverend Charles.
Hello, folks. Chuck Rhodes, Reverend Chuck I retired almost 10 years ago from Sonoma State University as Assistant VP for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management. I started before Gerry at Virginia Tech as an RA and stayed on there for graduate school and worked in the VP's office. From there, went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I stayed for 6 years, 4 of which was the equivalent of a Residence Life Coordinator, moved to the central staff in charge of student programs and staff selection for 7,000 students in housing, and was responsible for designing their, what they call community, their department-wide social and educational programming. Wasn't sure I wanted to stay in housing. I had been in housing all my life, so I left in 78, moved to San Francisco, a year of working for the Mayor's Office of Employment and Training under then Mayor Dianne Feinstein. And realized that did really well at the mayor's office, had a promising future, but realized I missed the university environment and in college campuses and the things that we were doing. So I went to Sonoma State University with the intention, like Joni, of only being there for 2 years. I swear I was in the rural part of California. I wasn't going to be there for 2 years and ended up being there for 31 with gradual increased responsibility, particularly in their leadership development, rest life, all kinds of things as AVP. And after I retired, actually went back to school, got my MDiv at the Interdenominational Theological Center, and I'm currently a doctoral student there.
Okay. Thank you, Chuck. Happy you're with us. Ms. Vickie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vickie Hawkins, and I retired about 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago. And I have retired from 2 different universities. The first one was Georgia Southern University. I went to Georgia Southern after completing 2 degrees at Appalachian State University. I went as a residence hall director and ended up retiring as the executive director of housing. Was there, like I said, for 31 years, director of housing for 17 years. And then my dream job became available and I applied, and my dream job was to come back to Appalachian. And I was fortunate enough to be hired as the senior associate director of university housing. And I retired after 6 years.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vickie. Happy you're with us too. Mike.
Gerry, love being on your porch. It's a great setup here. I went to Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, did my undergrad there, and tried out to be an RA my sophomore year and didn't get hired. So I tried again and got hired my junior year as an RA. And then as an undergrad, I was a hall director in the system there. And what a great experience. Had no idea what I wanted to do when I graduated at Mercer. Interviewed for jobs like door-to-door meet salesperson and just was completely lost. So a mentor of mine suggested that I go to the Saxa placement service, and that was always late in the season. Are they still doing Saxa?
Yes.
Placement?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I went there and got an interview at Georgia Southern, and a person named Vickie Hawkins hired me there. And she made that experience one that I decided that's the career I wanted to do. So if anyone has ever worked with me, you can blame Vickie Hawkins for that. After a year and I had to close down a building, reopen a building, I went back and I got my master's degree at Florida State and went to work after that at St. Louis University. Was an assistant director there for 2 years and then an associate director for 3 years doing business operations. At the age of 28, I became the director of housing at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and had the great opportunity to build 4 residence halls there, which is a director of housing dream. And I know other people on this podcast have had that opportunity. Did that for 30 years and retired in 2019. Took a week off and went to work for project management advisors, trying to help them start up their education division. And COVID hit 8 months, 10 months later. So that kind of ended. And so I'm sitting retired, not knowing what to do. And I'm seeing all my friends really suffering with COVID. And so I put my name out a couple of places and went back to work at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and have been the COVID response coordinator there for the year. And it's been rewarding, and hopefully I've brought some balance to some other people's lives by taking some of the work that they were being thrown at. So that's my story. Gerry, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Mike. I used to like to tell students that a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was an RA. And that really kind of moved me. I ended up, I think I may have said that I leaned in, but it wasn't with my head to student affairs, and found a job as a graduate hall director at my undergraduate institution. Thought I wanted to be a teacher and a coach. And I just did, but not in the way that I imagined. Early jobs in Texas and in Pennsylvania again. And then I arrived at Virginia Tech just a little bit after Chuck, and served as their first and only director of residence education for 17 years, and then had a wonderful opportunity to succeed Jim Day at the University of Georgia. Worked there for about 12 years and retired from there. Served on graduate faculty in the higher ed prep programs, student affairs programs, both at Virginia Tech and the University of Georgia, which is yet another sort of very rewarding opportunity. So, and we were talking earlier off the podcast recording about the many ways in which we're connected to each other. And I'm just absolutely delighted that my professional pals have decided to join me for a conversation. Our desire today is to help. It's been a very interesting 13 or 14 months. Lots of things turned upside down, and lots of things that people never experienced would happen for so long. And maybe people have experienced infectious diseases, and maybe they've experienced racial intolerance and injustice, and maybe they've experienced a very divisive politics. But I'm not sure we've ever had a chance to do that all at once. And so it's been a very interesting year. And a couple of weeks ago, I tuned into the CEO conference that was virtual. Props to that organization. Did a super job with an all virtual experience, but I had an opportunity to listen in. And this is what some housing professionals said as a description of how they feel: disrupted, uncertain, vulnerable. I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, but painful, overwhelmed, and Mr. Toad's wild ride. If any of you are Disney folks, Joni, you probably get me if I got that right. I hope I did. Anyway, our desire today is to talk a little bit about observations, maybe a little bit of our lived experiences in somewhat analogous circumstances, a little bit about what we think are helpful kinds of competencies and capacities, and then maybe also some final words of wisdom or tips, with the knowledge that we know there's really no right answer here. What we want to do with grace is to provide some perspective of, like I said, almost 200 years of experience. And we're just going to have a fun conversation. And I'm going to let my colleagues, sort of lead the way. I'll just ask the questions and we'll move along in conversation. So the first question is, what are your observations about the challenges of the life and times of the ACUHOI membership during the tumult of the last year? Some people have said we've had 2 pandemics. Some people we've said we've had an unparalleled election and an aftermath and a whole lot of other things occurring. But let's just open the door on this conversation with what have you observed and what do you think would be useful for the membership to hear from your wise seats?
I guess one thing I would want to share is sympathy. That, like, as you mentioned, Gerry, each of us have dealt with lots of different things over the years, but to throw it all together at the same time is just unfathomable to me. And the thing that impresses me the most is the stick-to-itiveness, I guess I would say, of the staffs and our colleagues that are still working, that they continue to, put their heart and soul into a job, sometimes without even having students on campus, and looking at the budget issues and everything around them, and still, trying to stay positive and looking for outlets to allow them to do that. I give them all kinds of credit. And, we've kind of jokingly said, thank goodness we're retired. But, on the other hand, part of me almost wishes I was out there, because I guess I just feel like, because of the experience that we've had, that perhaps we could assist in some way. But I think, maybe our best bet is to mentor from afar, to offer people a shoulder or a tissue or whatever they might need, just to share what's going on in their own lives.
And Joni, you've done that. You and Tom Ellett have done that with the password game of many colleagues that get together almost a year now on Wednesday evenings, and it's been a great outlet. It brings smiles to people's faces, and if people would like to get involved with that, I'm sure they can contact either you or Tom Ellett, and we can get them an invite. But it's been good to get reacquainted with some people. You put it in an interesting way, and being a recent retiree, I felt guilt for not having those responsibilities and not really being able to offer much advice because I've never been through it.
Right.
And I would talk to friends and colleagues, and it was more a listening ear, because you're dumbfounded by what everyone has gone through, and what right now is the new normal, and progressing through that. So for some retirees out there, I think they would love to help. And so I encourage people to reach out to people that have maybe stepped away from the profession on a full-time basis, but would be happy to hear and be a third party that would not have any feedback or pushback on your campus that you might have. And I know that we would all be happy to do that. And some of us have been doing that. But maybe it won't help everybody that's in the profession right now, but it would sure help our guilt. So use us.
I want to bounce off of something that Joni said, because in talking with some of my colleagues and friends who are still working, they describe this as the best of times and the worst of times. It's the best of times because of what Joni said. They are sticking to whatever is thrown their way, whether it be social injustice, the COVID, whatever. But then at the same time, they feel good because they are sticking to it and doing what they have been trained to do. They said that it is extremely difficult, but they are proud of themselves if they can remember all the good times. And I think it is important for everyone to remember that they're doing the very best that they can do. And when I talk with colleagues, just hearing them just explain what their day-to-day life is like, I'll just say, are you doing the best that you can do? And they're going, yes. And I said, that's all you can do. So don't worry about the other things. Do the best that you can do.
I've had, this is Chuck. I've I'm blessed to have had quite a few people who have come through our program at Sonoma who are now in leadership positions all over the country. And not just in housing and rest life, but in other areas. And have quite a few contacts with people who I've never met, who have found me for some reason, I don't know. Like all of you, I don't feel guilt. I'm glad I'm not in the day-to-day because I can kind of sit on my perch and listen to them and be supportive, and sometimes be a place for them to curse and to cry and to be angry and to be frustrated and to be creative. And I think, like Vickie said, what I'm noticing for some people, they have hit places of creativity that they never would have imagined. How do you supervise a large campus leadership and programming and student engagement program when there are very few people on campus? And how do you organize Greek life? So engaging in those conversations with people, the creativity that's come out of some of the places have been astonishing. I can't imagine myself being that creative, but I can be with them in conversation. And also, I think just trying to balance it all with short staff and frustrated. Several of the people have had to take on additional responsibilities because of budgeting. They're moving into areas that they did not have experience, but they've had to jump in because the campuses have not rehired for a variety of reasons. Even trying to do RA selection in a time like this is like, I never had to quite do that. So I think one is support and sympathy, but the other one is I'm hearing a lot of frustration from some folks who want to leave not because of dealing with the crisis, it's dealing with the campus politics and so forth, and feeling like their expertise is not being respected for a lot of reasons. A lot of it's external to the campus, and a lot of it's internal to the campus. And I was talking to someone who the university and the politicians demanded they reopen last fall at full capacity, and not really doing much planning in that. They said, in 2 weeks, we're going to reopen or something that close to that. And then had to really deal with the issues that came up when you have 18 and 19-year-olds, so being how we know 18 and 19-year-olds are going to be, and yet the external forces expected that the residence hall staff manage them in ways to correspond with the crisis. So what I'm hearing from folks is both very positive and yet a lot of frustration right now. And so I think what Joni said, just being a good listener at times and sometimes processing with them, just saying, you can talk to this, you can curse your college president to me because I'm not going to tell them, and they're trying to keep a good face with their staff and with their students during the time when they themselves are experiencing fears of their own around protecting their family and all the kinds of things.
This is sorry, Chuck.
Go ahead.
This is Joni again. And I just wanted to say, we haven't mentioned parents either, and parents of school-age children. And just again, I keep thinking unfathomable. The word used to be unprecedented, but either way, just the idea that folks are working from home and have children taking classes at home, or expecting the parents to step in as the teacher, and although some of those states are changing, not all are at this point. So, there's just, it's the inside pressure of your work and then the outside pressure of your family, and then the lack of seeing other parts of your family. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Chuck.
No, you didn't.
I think there's some terminology that I think is current now in a lot of things, particularly when it comes to leadership. And the terms volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, with the term VUCA, have been thrown around. And I think that to me is something I wanted to throw out and maybe have you respond to, because I think you all touched on each of those kinds of things that create the challenges that people have. It's ongoing. It is incredibly complex beyond credence in some ways, the level of detail, and then individuals' roles are changing. Chuck, you mentioned that. So I don't know if that sort of lights another couple of ideas in folks' head, but that was a thought I had that maybe we might be able to somehow put into this conversation of other things that you observed. But so far, this has been, I think, so supportive and helpful to our membership so far.
Yeah, what I've heard this year is that there's been Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, and on and on. And nobody knew where things were going and what to plan for. If I pulled out my crystal ball and I kind of see where things might be going for next year, it looks like we've kind of swung back and we're trying to get back to a little bit more normal. But I think the challenge is going to be is now you have staff, you have faculty, and you have administrators that have seen two sides, kind of the virtual world and the on-ground world. I think it might be a bigger challenge of how do we create that new normal and get buy-in from the people that you lead to buy into that. I think that's going to be the trick. And as Chuck said, campus politics plays into that. But people have gotten into habits. And so now, in some ways, if we want to get to the full college experience that our students want, how do we break some of those habits and get back into a routine is going to be a delicate process. And it might take several years to get there.
It seems like you're saying that the entire paradigm is changing in housing. I think about delivery of services from educational programs to what is the budget going to look like? So many institutions have had to pay for other departments, or the president needs money. So as an auxiliary, typically some housing funds have had to go that way. We need to be concerned about staff, the turnover with staff members. Are they going to come back? Are they so concerned and tired from what they've been dealing with this year? Can they remember why they went into the field and why they do what they do? I just think that there's a lot that's going to take a lot of time in order to come back to what is even somewhat near normal. And it may, from what we considered normal when we were working, and maybe it won't. So things have changed. And I think senior housing officers are going to have to lead the way and take that leadership with their staff members and help them to change and adjust, adapt, and just deal with everything that they are dealing with.
I think, Vickie, you hit something for me, because for me, as a social justice activist, we have to define what normal is going to be. And I think for a lot of schools, want to pick up where we left off in 2020. And I think that may lead to failure if we can think we'll go back to March 2020 and pick up and do the things like we used to do. I think the racial tension has caused us to begin to rethink what normal is on that surface. And that's something that we have not adequately dealt with forever. The disparities in general. So I think there's going to be a lot of time where we have to sit down and maybe force ourselves to do planning. Mike says he's in charge of the COVID response on the campus. I think very few campuses have gone that way. But the next step, I think, is to sit down and do some real planning across departments, institutional planning. The college the seminary that I'm attending, they've spent much of the past year in revisioning the campus. I mean, I'm amazed at this little small school of about 400 students. The president has been leading the faculty in a whole re-examination of its purpose, and does not see itself going back to where we were in 2020. All of our classes currently are online, and some faculty want to stay that way. Of course, we got millions of dollars worth of buildings you don't want to just turn over to somebody. And we do have residence halls there. But I think the process of revisioning for the what's next, because I think even outside of our campuses, the what's next will be a debatable issue for our communities and our nation. And so the colleges and universities, including residence halls and housing, need to be a part of that conversation. Because if we want to go backwards, for me, I think normal was not productive for a lot of folks. And we're seeing that in healthcare disparity, and we see it in our student enrollment. We see it in a lot of ways. One of my colleagues, one of my people I'm a mentor for, she lost her job. I mean, they've told her she can't come back next year. They love her. They don't have money. I mean, and she's a senior level. She's a vice president. Mm-hmm. And so, she's having to, while she's dealing with her staff, do her own personal issues. She's going to have to move someplace, and she's going to have to find a job, et cetera. So I think this whole process of just a deeper examination, and maybe that's what we're trying to do. I think we're going to go to a very extended period of deeper examination for the next, I think a couple of years, because I think Mike says that you can do a vision process and come up with a plan A, and that may change to plan B, C, D, A, B. If we did algebra, you remember when we used to do the combined numbers, I don't think we know what the future will be, but I think we have to be open to the whole planning and assessment, which is oftentimes missing in programs. We're going to have to continuously do planning and assessment for probably the next 3 or 4 years.
Chuck, that was old math. We're into new math now.
Okay. Well, I'm old.
So I think these comments are very good. I think we talked a lot about what change means and how we prepare ourselves for change. What are re-examinations and revisiting, visions, values, mission, et cetera. And I guess I'd like to see if I might ask you to kind of think deeply a little bit about maybe some other times in your experience, your lived experience as professionals, where circumstances on your campus or circumstances in the world have maybe caused us to do that kind of re-examination. And maybe there are some things that might be helpful to our membership as we think about what they can do. What are there some things we can talk about from our past experiences that might be useful in this new reexamination to find the next normal? I'll just say as an example, I wasn't at Virginia Tech when the shootings happened. I was at Georgia, but it affected me significantly, but not the way it affected the people who were on that campus. But to me, that was the college 9/11. And many things changed as a result of that. So that to me is just one example of maybe something that was very significant in lots of ways. It just wasn't as ongoing as was what we've been dealing with for the past 12 months. But are there other things that you can think about that might help, educate or enlighten our audience about this new visioning and managing change and being prepared for the next steps?
Well, one of the things that I hope it will happen is, you had mentioned 9/11, and for folks in the United States, that was a real change event.
Absolutely.
But the pandemic being a global experience, I think may assist us in hopefully looking at how global issues are, and, our international students and travel abroad and all types of things like that it's not just a U.S. experience, but excuse me, but as a global experience. I'm hopeful that we can learn, I guess going back to social justice, to try to get along, even though, I'm sorry, excuse me, this appears to me anyway to be the most divisive time in our country. I'm hopeful that looking forward that will change, and that people will realize that we need to work together. And, I guess when I think of international students in particular, that with the numbers, the demographics going lower in the U.S., that, campuses will be truly fighting for international students, and, everything will have to change, I think. I guess is my long answer, is that everything will have to change. And it goes back to, I think, expectations. I think of, I feel so badly for the first year students in college this year, because last year, what a terrible time to be a senior in high school, not to experience anything that all of us did, all of the activities and the friendships and just everything else that went along with it. And then what do? You go to college your first year, and it's more of the same. That, it's the same and it's different at the same time, I guess. So I don't have any real answers, I'm sorry to say, but, there's just so much to think about. And I guess I go back to the thought of, we're here for folks to listen to and assist in any way we can. But, and I think too about, 5-year plans and 10-year plans. And, once I gave a speech, and when I got up, I ripped the notes in half, kind of as a joke that I would know what I was going to talk about. And I was completely lost. And I kind of think that way with 5 and 10-year plans now too, because everything's changed. And, you go back to the ABCD, where do we go? So perhaps disjointed to you, but in my mind, this makes perfect sense.
I love
Joni, I think you come up on a good point there. Is whenever we come up with a plan, there is a process that we go through, no matter what that structure is or whatever. So I think if I would add some advice here, is spend time on developing the process and take what you've used in the past to help you guide that process. But the most important part of it is trust the process. If you trust the process, you'll get there. You might not know where you're going, but if you trust that process, you're going to get to that end. And I think if that would be one thing that I could add to this discussion, is really spend the time up front to develop the process based on your skills, based on the skills of others that have been successful in that, and then put that process to test, but trust that process as you move forward.
Gerry, I want to go back to your question of lived experience.
Yeah.
It goes way back. And I thought about this. In 1968, I joined the first class of regularly admitted Black students at Virginia Tech. It was a time when it was a landmark year for Tech because it was the year that it broke 10,000 in enrollment and it broke 100 Negro students. Mm-hmm. And it was also a time that they were bringing women in larger numbers. So the culture of that school was changing. And talk about social justice, I would say, and I was thinking about that this morning, for a while I lived in the wing there were 22 guys, 20 white and 2 Black. None of us had gone to integrated schools before we got to college. All of the white students had gone to all white schools, and I had come, and Ted had come from an all Black school. And also in that process, except for one Northerner, all of the white students had Black women who were domestic help in their households. They've been raised mostly by African-American women. And so there was a lot of tension on campus. And then when I moved into leadership programs, I cannot tell you the number of times I was called the N-word. But the university, Dr. Hahn, who was president then, had made a commitment that integration was going to work. And Virginia Tech was one of the first Southern schools that actually racially integrated without a court order and police presence. I mean, most people don't know that, but they were there. And he had to have faculty meetings, and he directed faculty and staff to do some things. And at the same time we were doing racial integration and gender integration, we were dealing with Vietnam War. And so, while we say this divisive now, and I think a part of that is because of the social media, it was a very divisive time. We had alumni who withdrew financial support to the university because they had coloreds coming, and they had women coming. I mean, there was wasn't just about race; it was about gender. They were comfortable with the status quo, and politicians were having fits, and the governor was having fits. It's like, and we lived through it. I think a part of that process was we didn't go far enough. But we went as far as we could at that time. And so I'm not judging what happened then. I spent my 4 years at Tech, because I stayed for graduate school, with the Heidi-Tighty still playing Dixie at the football and the sports events, and the Confederate flag still waving. And we did, I was there at a time when there were no Black faculty members. And so I think what I'm trying to get at is that we did the best that we could for then. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying, well, we should have done this, but we did the best that we could. And I think a part of the lesson would be is, like Mike says, we trust the process and knowing that we're going to do the best we can for what we know for right now. And there will be days where I'll look back and say, well, we should have done something different. It was just this year that Virginia Tech took the names off of 2 residence halls and named them for African Americans because of the link that the honorees had with inequality, slavery, et cetera. A lot of schools are doing that right now. In some cases, it's just surface washing. Other schools are going much deeper into examining the social justice issues. But the bottom line is, I think back to that 50 plus years ago when I went into Tech, almost like a dummy, because if I knew now what I was going to experience, I probably wouldn't have gone, but it was the right thing for me to do in my life and my career. But there was leadership, and the people were doing the best they could. So I don't, and I think that's one of the things I would have to say to folks as you sit down and trust your process. You won't be perfect. We don't know. Some scientists are saying that there may be another virus brewing right now. You know, we don't know. But I think back about that the Vietnam experience, the war experience was very divisive. Virginia Tech arrested students. Buildings were occupied. It was a military school, and students were allowed to have guns in their rooms in those days. And I have been out there and watched people bringing shotguns to demonstrations, rifles, I should say, to demonstrations, and it was legit at that time. So I think, 50 some years later, we still haven't resolved the issue. And I would suspect if I were alive 50 years from now, we would still be sorting out what 2021 means for us.
Yeah. Thanks for that story, Chuck. Your personal reflections are certainly extremely helpful because there seems to be some fairly significant parallels to our current day and times. So,
Gerry, can I add one thing?
Go ahead, Vickie.
As a housing professional, every one of us will handle a myriad of crises throughout our career, whether it be a fire, a hurricane, a suicide, whatever. And I truly believe that we must ensure that we do have the strategic planning that goes along with it. And we do have to trust the process. But sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you're just not sure what to do. So I hope everyone will go back and lean on all of the skills of being a strong and effective leader. We all know that decision-making is probably one of the top qualities of any professional. So if you can gather all the information, listen to different types of individuals, different types of thought processes, then make the best decision that you can make for whatever is happening, then it's like Michael said, you do have to trust the process and it should go as well as possible. And then at the end, sit down, think about it. Make sure you involve all of your staff members because sometimes your opinion is not always the right one. I know that's hard to believe, but getting other people's advice and their input can certainly help make you stronger for the next situation, whatever that might be.
Vickie, you're not talking about me 35 years ago.
I am definitely talking about you 35 years ago.
I heard her call you Michael, so I was.
Yeah. That's when I had to sit in her office.
Yeah, I want to jump in. Vickie, what you just said reminded me of an observation that I've had about housing people for a very long time, and I'm guilty as charged. And I think at times this is an extremely powerful and helpful set of mindsets, and sometimes it's also very challenging. But I've always considered housing folks to be overachievers.
Absolutely.
Right? I've always considered housing folks to be fixers. And I've always considered housing folks to be engaged in the elusive pursuit of perfection. Guilty as charged, okay? But I think sometimes that mentality turns on itself to create some incredible stresses for us. And that's why I think some of the comments that you've made about trusting the process and trusting past experiences kind of helps mitigate maybe some of the stress that comes from being an overachiever, from being a fixer, from being, trying to make it perfect, because it's not. You just said it's not, right?
It's not.
So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think that mindset helps us maybe to engage in a way that that allows us to be forgiving of ourselves. Just a thought, but I really do want to throw that out there and see if there are any other thoughts about this, lived experiences. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, one other things in what Vickie was talking about, decision making, and what Chuck was talking about social justice and making those tough decisions. I think we're all saying it, but we haven't really spoke the words. In all of that, you need to be true to your values.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mike, that, for me, when you said values, some of you will remember this from many years ago when Tom Shampoo did a program on for us at Akuhoai on behavior styles.
Yep.
And I still use that. And I use that in my work because I was very conscious about having diverse behaviors in our department. And sometimes Cindy and I would say, we need to find an analyzer to join the staff this year or something of that nature, because I think too many of our staffs are people that we're comfortable having lunch with, but they don't bring a diversity of thought to the process. And so when every year, twice a year actually, we kept our values. So we did strategic planning, and our values were the core of what we did. But we also had the process could be cantankerous, even in the best of times. And that was a part of our culture, was we wanted it to be cantankerous because we became a stronger group because we had folks of different backgrounds and behavior styles and ethnicities and orientations and so forth. So we really worked very hard. As a person of color, I have been oftentimes in situations where they wanted me to be the representative diversity, but did not want a diversity in thought and behavior. And that has always failed. And we feel good for, I don't sing Kumbaya anymore. I don't want to do the Kumbaya moment. To hell with that. Because I think for me in our staff meetings, we always left in agreement, but we worked on a win-win model rather than a win-lose model. This is all back to the Tom Shampoo stuff from years ago. And that sometimes getting to that win-win was a real dogfight. But in the end, people bought in. We felt membership in the group. And, I still have people call me now years later saying, Chuck, what about this? Because it was the process. There was a diverse process, not only in representative diversity. And I think too many of us sometimes get into the representative diversity. I've had some phone calls from some African Americans who are representative diversities on college campuses that are not going to return after this year because they can't stand that they got a Black person, a Latino person there, but the university is not willing to listen to a different viewpoint. And so I think for me, I'm in agreement with Vickie in terms of the values. Mm-hmm. We clearly identified our values all the way down to our RA and our student leaderships. They were printed, they were posted, and we talked about them repeatedly. And everything that we did came back to those values. But we also understood that process was not a kumbaya kind of moment.
Yeah.
And I think a resource that we haven't mentioned are the Akuhoai competencies. Because Gerry, when you had mentioned that when we briefly discussed the podcast earlier, I went back and took a look at them, and I would suggest that folks that are currently working do that, not when they're in the midst of a crisis, but when they have a few moments to sit down and really look at them, because they weren't developed yesterday, but they work for tomorrow. I think I was very surprised when I looked at them, that because they are so inclusive of so many things that are going on in the world right now, that I think they would be a great resource for folks as well.
Super. I think it's a great reference. And Grant, at the end of this podcast, is also going to share a number of pieces of information about other resources from Akuhoai as well. So I'll just ask you to look for that or to listen to that toward the end of the podcast. So let's talk a little bit more. You said competencies, Joni, and I want to be mindful of time. We do have a couple. Are there other kinds of competencies or capacities that you think are pertinent as you look at what's happening and as you think about your past experiences, or the things that you want to pull out as shining stars that might be helpful for folks to think about. Joni's just mentioned the competencies in general, and I think it's a great resource, a beautiful tome for everybody. So.
I don't know if it's a competency, but maybe a skill that needs to be developed, or and as we move forward, or even through this crisis that we've been in, there's a lot of looking at what others are doing, and trying to compare the amount of work that people have had to do that are on campus that are essential employees. And something that I picked up from my grandfather is a hard work ethic. And I think if you, and we've said it several times, that you're doing your best, you're trying your best, you're putting all your work into it. What I've always found, and people that have ever worked with me know that I've had this tagline: somewhere, somehow, it all catches up with you. And it's either going to be on the positive or it's going to be on the negative side. And I guess some people will call it carpe diem, but it really does. And so I would think, as difficult as it's going to be, especially as we go through the process for opening in the fall, whatever that might look like, looking at your own operation and not looking at what others are doing around you, other leaders that might have different values, is a really important thing. And know that you're doing the right thing, you're working your hardest, you're doing your best, and you don't know when it'll be recognized, if it'll ever be recognized, but it will catch up eventually.
I would throw in also having balance. And I think right now we're talking about work and crisis management. And Joni mentioned this earlier, and perhaps others. I think having balance, and working in student housing can be a never-ending story, and particularly during crisis. And that there were periods in my life where I did not pay as close attention to family and to other things, and my life got out of balance, and I had a big old heart attack about 20-some years ago. And so I think having the balance of paying attention to those that are important, whether it's through spirituality, through health, through other things, but particularly in this triple crisis or quad crisis that we're in right now, it's easy to get out of balance. And, with parents calling and faculty calling and students and staff and et cetera, it seems like there's never a moment when somebody else doesn't need you. But as the airlines say, put on your mask first before helping others. And that doesn't mean being selfish, but having that balance in one's life, that some days just take off and go play golf or go swim or have lunch with your kids. And I know with me, when I'm working even now with all the things going on, I have a baby great grandnephew. That brings such joy to spend 5 minutes with him in armored and covered up life, And I think too often we don't really talk about the importance of having balance, because as we go back to whatever the what next is, there will be so many demands professionally on us that if we don't take off and do some things to keep balance in our lives, I don't think as well. I don't plan as well when I don't get enough sleep or having a healthy meal, And I know people who, as I used to live at KFC. I said I was engaged to Colonel Sanders. before the heart attack. No longer. But I think it's important for people to have that balance in their lives and to nurture their families and to be nurtured by their families and their friends.
Yeah.
And balance means turning off that technology.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking about is very obvious, but I think it's extremely important, and that is effective communication. Mm-hmm. And I think effective communication with yourself is something that sometimes we overlook. And by that, I mean, it is important to document as much as you can what has occurred. One, just for a historical perspective. And secondly, if you need to go back and share information, you've got it written down as opposed to relying on your memory. It's obviously important to communicate with your staff all the way down to every single staff member, whatever the category is. And then don't forget to communicate up. And there are going to be lots of times when you may not agree with what your supervisor is asking you to do, but all of us have a supervisor or had a supervisor, and we need to remember to keep them informed and to support them.
I guess I would add too that one of the things that I always talk to my staff about, that I felt our job was a job of exceptions. And my guess is during this time that the pandemic has really emphasized that there are so, you just can't go by a simple rule anymore, would be my thinking. And also to remember what's really important, that it's hard to do that, and it's easy for me to say that as I look back. But to truly remember what's important, and that you can't do it all, but be satisfied with what you're doing, because you're doing an awful lot. You're still having a wonderful, positive influence on students. It's just different.
Good point.
Yeah, one of the things that I heard from some others that I chatted with in preparation for today was, and Vickie, it really hits your point about talking to yourself, communicating with yourself, because at the heart of that is the power of reflection. Is really stopping and really kind of being real and being vulnerable. I guess for me, I find that probably the most important and powerful tool we have now is emotional intelligence. Because it starts with knowing yourself, and then it starts with knowing others. So to me, as hard as it is to stop when all of these things, Chuck, you just mentioned, there's always going to be somebody asking you to do something. When all these things are pressing upon you, I think it's still important to take a moment to reflect intentionally, because it helps with balance for yourself. But I think it may help also to put some things in perspective. And sometimes that's self-meditative, and sometimes it's talking to someone who cares about you and knows you better than maybe yourself, to give you, a little talk back, if you will, about where you are. Other thoughts on competencies or capacities?
I think it's really important to remember to laugh. That, Chuck, as you were talking, you mentioned the never-ending story. It reminded me, my mother took my boys when they were young to see that movie, The Never-Ending Story. And she brought them home and she said, never again. That story went on and on. And I said, well, that was kind of the point, it was never ending. But, I do think at the end of the day, if you can't look back at something that happened and laugh, whether you talk about the specific person or not, just to get that out and to share it with others. I mean, that's the only thing that's gotten me through, 13 months in the same house with the same man and the same dog, so.
Some people have said laughing is like internal jogging.
Right.
Oh, I do a lot of that then. From a theological viewpoint, I would say that all the great
prophets and all would go to the hills to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
They would get away. And so, not just limited to Christianity, they would go to the hills. They had to get away from their daily work. And they would just, we read that in not just in the Christian faith, but other faith paths that they, whether it's Buddha or whomever, Dr. King did the same thing. Many of the great leaders would take that time out. The demands were on their back, and they would still say, time out, I got to go feel the well again, And so, I would say that the laughter was a part of all the great prophets' lives. We may not talk about them, but, they laughed and drank wine. And good wine.
Yeah, good wine. Right.
Hallelujah. And had fun. But I think that's for us, the same as balance. It's just, as you're saying, Gerry, it's just, you just got to take some time out.
Yeah.
Chuck, we know why you chose Sonoma State. It was all that wine in your backyard.
I lived my last 20 some years. I lived about 5 or 6 minutes from some of the best wineries in the world. But after a while, I stopped going because I got into life,
Well, folks, I want to sort of give us an opportunity for some concluding thoughts. One of the things I shared with y'all was if you had any words of wisdom or lessons learned or just caring words of support that you might want to share with our membership to sort of put a punctuation on our lively and insightful conversation this afternoon.
I'll go ahead and start. Now that I'm in those retirement years, I've failed retirement twice now. But for the young professionals or even the mid-levels or anybody that's still in the profession, I think there's 3 things as you look to retirement, and you should be looking at retirement very early on, is really three points. One, make sure that you have a good financial advisor and be able to plan so that you can have a great retirement and not have to worry about it. 2, it's not all about the resources, but know what those expenses are. And one of those expenses, and who knows what the future will be, but know where your health care is coming from and really be able to plan. I think that what I'm hearing from friends of mine, both in the profession and out of the profession, is what's keeping them or preventing them from doing everything that they want to do is knowing that they have enough resources for the health care that they did not plan for. Mm-hmm. And I guess the most important thing, and this is probably where I failed the most in retirement, is spend some time thinking about how you want to spend your time in retirement. Chuck has a very clear plan, and it's admirable. But you can only travel so much, and then in a pandemic, you can't travel at all. You can only play so much golf, and you can only sit on a beach for so long. But what are those hobbies? What do you want to do? It's a steep cliff when you go in higher education, and then all of a sudden you look at your phone and there's no messages anymore. So how are you going to spend your time? Really think about that. I think it's something that is forgotten. And I would hope that people are starting to think about that now. Start developing your list, start developing your hobbies that you can carry on and spend and do better in retirement.
I do agree with that, Mike, although I've also found that the time has flown. And, our former athletic director used to say, I get up in the morning with nothing to do, and by noon I'm half done. And that's kind of the way I feel too some days, and I like a particular program on at 4:00, and I every day at 4, I think, how can it be 4:00 already?
Right.
Time just has flown. And I mean, I keep a paper calendar so I can cross the days off. So when I know when it's a weekend, not that it makes a difference, but I just like to know what other folks are up to. But I guess, Gerry, back to the parting thoughts, just a couple things that I would recommend, that folks be nice to people, particularly in this time period, because you never really know what their burden is when they come to you. And also, I would suggest that you have very few regrets. I look back and I'm upset that I traded a car in too early. But other than that, I think my life was in pretty good shape. So, and then the last one would be true to your school. Wherever you are, whether you're going to be there 2 years or 38 years, be true to your school. And then in that process, be true to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
My parting thoughts, similar to Joni's, I thought about just give yourself grace and give others grace. Because if you don't, it's what we've already talked about. Karma can come back to haunt you sometimes. And these are difficult times, but a well-developed housing professional has all of the skills, all of the abilities to handle whatever comes to them in some form or fashion. So give grace.
Mike, before I retired, I was having some minimum health issues, and I went to a counselor. And one of the things that the counselor suggested was not to focus on what I was going to retire from, but what I was going to retire to. And then how would I know when I was ready to retire? And when that time came, the university was going through some transitions, and I was offered a new position with a lot more money. But I knew the time had come for me to retire. I mean, I could have stayed on for more years, but I was emotionally ready to say, I've given you all 31 years. I've done a lot, and I'm done. And so I think that what you're saying is, know what you're going to retire to. It took me several years after those counseling sessions, but when the opportunity came up, I knew that day, the day had come that I was ready, even though they kept saying, well, we reorganized and we got some, you can get some good money. And I think, I got enough money. If not, I can always go on welfare because I've contributed or not. The other thing that I've been focusing on with my counselor, because I still see a counselor by phone, and two things have come up for me, and I call it, both of them, they've evolved into what I call PPP. And one of them is I'm looking at, I'm getting myself prepared for my post-pandemic potential. And that when this passes, I've been doing some things to be prepared for what we say, my what's next. And the other one, the new PPP, is my post-pandemic purpose. And really feel like I still have a purpose in life to do things. And I think that can be true for us organizationally. As we look at our housing program, what is your post-pandemic purpose? Our purpose will not be the same in 2022 as it was in 2019. Even though we may be housing and residence life and food service, I think we've gone through enough things that we will continue to do some things a little bit differently. And I don't think necessarily we haven't taken time, maybe haven't had the time to look at what is our purpose of our programs and what is our potential. I think there's great potential. Some of us are sitting on $100 million plants around there that may not fill up right away, and we still got mortgages to pay. And so I think, and staff, and this is not the first fiscal crisis that we've gone through.
Yeah.
And this is not the first health crisis. I won't reopen the conversation, but I was in a heavily hit area during the AIDS pandemic, and we didn't know when that was going to end. Yep. And we were having to make some choices and do all kinds of things that were external and internal and everything else. So this is not our first one. It feels overwhelming right now, but I can tell you that whether it was in the racial social justice one or the HIV/AIDS crisis, it was overwhelming then.
I don't want to make a concluding comment, but I do want to share one thing for folks. I think if you look at this Hollywood Squares scenario that we're dealing with right now, it's clear that what has sustained us is relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I look at all the people in this picture, and I am so deeply joyful and grateful for you in my life. And it sustained me. And Chuck, my PPP is Pen Pal Project.
Right.
I write notes to people. It really doesn't matter if I get notes back, but I do. Right. And there's just nothing quite as wonderful as an old-fashioned handwritten note, even with my hieroglyphics that I send out. I just think that for me, relationships are what sustain us, because it's something as challenging as the times we've been in. None of us do it alone.
Right.
We do it together. And I had to rely on my good colleagues here to open up this wonderful conversation. All I had to do was ask the questions, but you all provided the answers, and we collectively accomplished something. That to me is a big takeaway. And I'm truly grateful to Aku Hawaii for giving us this opportunity to share, but also to just bring this group of people together. All of us are retired, and yet we're still doing this.
Right.
What does that say?
Well, I thought we were getting paid, though.
We're not.
The check is in the mail.
Joni, put that in the chat. I'll respond. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
I just think it's really amazing that we've been able to recruit wonderful people to respond to people who are still working, and that says so much about all of you, about what you want to share in such a caring and positive way with your colleagues. I'm just so grateful and appreciative for all of you to do that, and grateful to Aku Hawaii for giving us this porch opportunity to share and help a little bit.
I'm grateful that you invited me.
I'm glad you're still around, Chuck.
Even though you left the Hokies.
Well, at this point in my life, I feel like I'm allowed to have multiple allegiances. So
that's so true.
Yeah. But that the other thing is the allegiance we have with this association, which is really quite remarkable and quite nimble and active and helpful, and in so many ways. And it's because of folks like y'all. So I'm just truly joyful and truly grateful.
Thanks, Gerry.
Anybody else want to share anything else as we say good night?
I think one other thing that I meant to say is that it's important that you use your support. Mm-hmm. If it's in the Aku Hawaii arena, at a conference, a virtual conference, or if it's smaller groups within your state, I became a better leader, a better advocate by being reaffirmed from my colleagues and bringing that information back. I know that Vickie and Joni's an honorary member of the, what do we call them? What the WOHOs, which is a great support group, but it not only those groups provide support, but they also bring you information that makes you an expert on your own campus and brings that respect to yourself. So it's really important to invest in yourself by getting involved in those groups. And there's formal ways and there's informal ways.
Before I retired, I set up a Facebook group for past and current student staff and professional staff and student leaders. And it's still going. And so for me, the recognition, not directly, but I have so many of my former student leaders who are teachers. And so every now and then I'll send out a little note out and thank them because I know that they're going through something. And for my former students who are in the medical profession, I send out a little group thing and says, I really appreciate y'all being out there. And so I feel like I'm still connected, and the feedback they give me is much more than I give them. I mean, it's been just a real joy that I have I'm gonna start getting emotional. I have student staff who have found me for my very first year at Sonoma in 1980 and have given me encouragement. And so I think learning how to, using some of the techniques to stay in touch with our former students and our RAs and whatever has just been a real blessing for me. I had to hang the phone. I was actually engaged with one of my former student staff members who's been going through some medical issues right now, who contacts me every day. I'm still his uncle in some ways. And because he's lost both of his parents. So I'm involved. So I think that whole sense of community is you talked about it, Mike, in terms of a community of professionals, but not that I lean on them, but I really do appreciate the former students and former staff members that remind me that those 40 years, almost, the 31 at Sonoma, did have an impact. They had meaning for them.
And it's still paying dividends for you, that hard work.
Yeah.
Well, my friends, this has been, it so far exceeded my expectations. And I appreciate each one of you. I appreciate the dialogue and the conversation, and just appreciate you.
And that concludes this episode of the Akuhawai Stories podcast. I'd like to thank our host, Gerry Kowalski, and our guests, Joni Schmidt, Vickie Hawkins, Michael Schultz, and Chuck Rhodes for joining us. Our podcast is hosted via Podbean, and past and future episodes can be found at acuhoi.podbean.com or on our website, www.acuho-i.org/podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast via your favorite streaming service so you don't miss an episode. Our main site also has a wide range of helpful resources, events, and initiatives for campus housing professionals at all levels. You can additionally follow Akuhawai on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I'm Grant Walters. I hope you join us again soon. See you next time.